The Bob Murphy Show, episode 137.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be talking with Tom DiLorenzo, who I'm sure many of you already know. But for those who don't, Tom is an economics professor at Loyola University. He is an Austrian economist. He's a senior fellow of the Mises Institute. And he's written a bunch of books on Lincoln, and he's not a huge fan of the guy. So the main thing we're going to be talking about in this interview is his latest book, which is called The Problem with Lincoln. But as I say, Tom's got a whole bunch of other books in this genre, including Lincoln Unmasked. Besides that, though, we also talk about some of Tom's earlier career, and he actually has published stuff in top-ranked economics journals, right? So don't buy the myth that Austrian economists can't do math, right? So we talk a little bit about that stuff as well. Let me just mention, if you've never heard somebody explain what the problem is with Lincoln, if you just have gotten the standard treatment in your grammar school, or do they even call it grammar school anymore? That's what they called it when I went to a Catholic school. In any event, if you just heard that, Lincoln's great, he's one of the greatest presidents, if not the greatest, because he freed the slaves and saved the Union, and who could possibly be against the guy, then you're in for a treat, all right? Let me just say, it should go without saying, but it needs to be said in today's climate. Obviously, Tom and I are not defenders of slavery. It was morally abhorrent and economically disastrous, but nonetheless, just because the southern states had slavery does not mean that it made sense for the North to invade them, just as we're not committed to rooting for King George against the American colonists, even though the 13 colonies breaking away had slavery, right? That wouldn't follow. So likewise, don't misconstrue this as an endorsement of slavery, the fact that Tom is vehemently opposed to the North's aggression against the South. And in any event, besides that stuff, as you'll see in the interview, there's more to it than merely, Tom disagrees with the strategy or the policy of trying to violently suppress the secessionist movement. It's way more than that. Lincoln did things like even jailing Northern opponents of the war, which doesn't really line up with our textbook views of Lincoln being the greatest president ever. So without further ado, here is my interview with Tom DiLorenzo. Well, Tom, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Pleased to be with you, Bob. Good to see you.
Nice seeing you. Sorry, I think this is the first Mises University that I haven't gone to in 20 years. So,
wow. Well, we miss you.
I miss being there. So I'm glad to get you on the show here. And as I always do with people who I know a lot of the listeners are going to know from beforehand, can you just give us the quick version of your superhero origin story? How did you go from being a mild-mannered youngster to the superstar you are today?
In 5 minutes or less?
You can take up to 10.
Okay. Well, my biography. I guess. Well, I was an economics major in school, in college, and I was influenced by a Chicago school professor of mine, and my freshman year in college, I ran across a bookcase in a classroom that had all the back issues of the Freeman magazine. And so I started reading, and I ended up reading like all of them. And, I read all these articles by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and all the William H. Hutt and all the older generation free market economists. And that sort of got me hooked on economics. And they were all good writers too. Most of them anyway were really good writers. So I really got into that. And when I went to graduate school, the same professor sort of turned me on to public choice economics. So I went to graduate school. Back then it was called Virginia Polytechnic Institute, VPI.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they got a good football team, they changed the name to Virginia Tech. I guess it sounds more footballish, Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
Kind of like Texas Tech, Virginia Tech. And so when I went there, to study under Buchanan and Tulloch in the public choice school. And my first semester at micro was taught by an Austrian economist, Richard Wagner, who I think is still at George Mason. I don't know if he's retired yet or not. But he used Human Action by Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman's Price Theory as the textbooks. So I got a good dose of Chicago price theory and Human Action as a textbook. So ever since then, and that's when I decided that my two big interests would be Austrian economics and public choice economics. And so I got my degree and became a professor, taught at SUNY Buffalo when I got out of school, and then George Mason for 8 years. And I ended up co-authoring 9 books with James Bennett at George Mason. Our first one was called Underground Government, the Off-Budget Public Sector. It's about how the Cato Institute published it. It was about how governments historically responded to tax revolts by pretending to comply with the taxpayer demands to reduce taxes or reduce spending or borrowing. But at the same time, they would set up off-budget enterprises, off-the-book spending, and spend anyway, that way, for various gimmicks. And so that was my first book, co-authored with James Bennett. And we ended up co-authoring 9 books altogether and a bunch of articles.
Can I ask you, Tom, was one of them the Food and Drug Police?
Yeah, one of them was the Food and Drug Police. I think the subtitle was America's Nannies, Busybodies, and Petty Tyrants.
I don't know if I've ever told you this, just a little background. When I was an undergrad at Hillsdale College, I was in a debate that we organized on drug legalization. And so I went to the library to get out everything I could. And a lot of it was real, wonky stuff and when I found your guys' book on that, I was like, oh, finally, some people who are really like hardcore. So anyway, that was like the best book that I found.
You must be the one sale we had at Hillsdale College. Yeah, it was. Well, at the time there was this hysteria over smoking, the tobacco industry, and so we basically thought, well, these people aren't going to stop. They're going to go after Twinkies and Coca-Cola and everything else in terms of tax, trying to tax them out of business.
And again,
so we wrote that book.
And also, it's I think worth mentioning, and I do want to hear the rest of your autobiographical sketch here, but. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, but in the 1980s, I distinctly remember when they were doing things like banning smoking from restaurants and stuff like that people on the right would say, oh, what next? Are you gonna, ban sugary sodas and things? And I distinctly remember the advocates of the bans were just mocking them and saying, you fools, stop, muddying the word. No one's going to go after your soda. That's never going to happen. Smoking is a very serious thing. And of course, the critics were right. The slippery slope, did incur.
Yeah, they even there's a guy that wrote a book, one of the leaders of the anti-smoking. And I've never been a smoker. I'm annoyed by cigarette smoke. But one of the leaders, he wrote a little book that we ran across. It had a title something like "Legislative Approaches to Banning Smoking." And so one of my interviews, I remember a radio interview, I said, well, these are prohibitionists, because what else would you call legislative approaches to banning anything other than prohibition? And so I said, well, that'll create black markets, and you'll end up having kids being in contact with criminals to buy cigarettes like they would, buy heroin now or something else. And they were all, and of course, everybody just lampooned me for saying that. Oh, that'll never happen. They're never going to want to try to ban things. But that was the name of the guy's book. And he was one of the leaders of the whole movement to tax. It's interesting, though, they always wanted to tax the daylights out of tobacco, but not ban it, because the government, there's too much money in the government to raising taxes on taxing cigarettes and booze, for that matter. And so they never did ban it. And so, so I wrote that. We also wrote a book called Official Lies, How Washington Misleads Us, at the same, James Bennett and I. It was kind of popular for a while. I think Jim actually wrote a sequel to that. I was busy on doing something else at the time, so he went ahead and wrote a sequel to Official Lies back in the day, we wrote a big fat book on called Destroying Democracy too. We've got a big database of government grants that had gone, federal grants that had gone to various so-called nonprofit organizations that were almost overwhelmed, primarily left-wing political pressure groups. And so the phenomenon was government giving billions of dollars every year to all these so-called nonprofits, supposedly to administer the welfare state or to feed the hungry and so forth. And they would use the money to lobby for higher taxes and bigger spending. And then when the government got the bigger spending money, they would share some of it with the same groups. And it was sort of a circle that, so a racket. And we called it Destroying Democracy. I guess the idea I got for that was James Madison's famous essay number 10 in The Federalist, where he said the violence of faction, which is basically rent-seeking special interest groups, have destroyed democracy everywhere. And so the book is about how the government not only enforces the constitutional limits on faction, but it actually feeds them with taxpayer dollars and promotes them. And that was the theme of that book, which was also published by the Cato Institute. I think we published a couple of the very first books they ever published at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I remember at the time, Bill Niskanen was not the president, but I think he had some big title at Cato. And when we went over the book, Jim Bennett and I went over the book with him, and he was, I guess he would be like the academic vice president at the time of that institution. And he made a prediction. He said at the time, if your book is right, if this is right, that this is so important, this government funding of all these special interest groups, then Robert Bork will not be appointed to the Supreme Court, because Bork was in the process of being appointed. Mm-hmm. And of course, the rest is history. We know he wasn't appointed to the Supreme Court because all of these groups were very well organized and very well funded by the government, as Jim and I wrote about in our book, and they defeated Bork and a lot more to that.
So can I just ask, his theory, Niskanen's was saying, because the government wouldn't want somebody like Bork on the court who would interfere with its extra constitutional prerogatives, so it would use all the interest groups that were in its pocket to sick them? Was that the idea? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Bill Niskanen was a classic Chicago school guy, so everything has to be a hypothesis test.
All right.
And so after he read our, it's a big long book. I don't know how many. I forget. It's 400 and some pages. It's the largest book I've ever co-authored or authored. And after he read it, he sort of summarized it into this, short hypothesis that he proposed. Mm-hmm. He said, if Bork is defeated, then there's something to this book, that this is a very potent political force, all these government-funded special interest groups. Mm-hmm. But if Bork gets on the court, then you and Jim Bennett have probably overestimated the clout or the power that these groups have. And so we were right. And I didn't throw it in his face at the time either. I'm just out of curiosity, was he saying it like with genuine sincerity, or was he saying it almost like you thought he believed, of course, Bork's going to get appointed, and so therefore you guys are wrong? No, I think it was sincere. I think he was sincere about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think he was saying the latter. Yeah. So we wrote all these books like this, and we got into the nanny state was big. And
can I ask you, Tom? I'm curious. Did anybody counsel you, or did you consider, hey, maybe I should focus on peer-reviewed journal articles for my career, and if I just write books for the public, I'm going to get pigeonholed as a not serious academic?
Well, I always did both. I always kept, for many years, not so much anymore, but for all those years, I got out of school in 1979. I got my PhD. And I published a lot of articles. I probably published in the next 5 years, probably 25 or 30 journal articles, including 2 in the American Economic Review, Southern Economic Journal, Economic Inquiry, 5 in Public Choice, International Review of Law and Economics. So I published all those, and I got tenure at George Mason. Okay,
for the listeners who don't know, the American Economic Review, that's like the top journal, or it's in the top 3, right? So that's great. Austrians aren't supposed to be able to do that, Tom.
No, I made a lot of Austrians angry, especially at George Mason. Because there were some of the older Austrians, one in particular, who was telling the younger Austrians. At the time, I got to George Mason the same year. Don Lavoie, Jack High, and Richard Fink, who were all Austrians, got there, and Walter Williams got there a year before us at George Mason. But there was an older faculty member who was counseling the younger ones, not me, but the other three, as don't even try to publish in the mainstream journals, because if there's an Austrian bent to it, you don't have a chance. And that person didn't really appreciate the fact that I was publishing in the mainstream journals anyway.
Can I ask you what the articles were? I mean, was it like just a technical thing, or was it actually?
The AER articles were Jim Bennett and I worked on. Both of them were sort of econometric articles on how Congress, members of the Senate and the House, spent their own personal budgets, and so it was sort of a public choice topics more than Austrian economics topics, and it was published in the AER in the early '80s, and we had two of them there.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I did that, and I've always kept my hand in that, and I published quite a bit in antitrust and regulation topics in journal articles. But then, after you do so much of that, Jim Bennett convinced me that you'll enhance your reputation more if you start writing books, because people are impressed by books. Mm-hmm. And plus, it was more fun, and it gets kind of boring devoting your whole life to writing another 10-page journal article that no one reads. And I realized as a professor, because that's the coin of the realm in academia. Mm-hmm. I even had a dean in my former employer tell me that the publication of books is of no value. And I went back to her and said, even a Harvard University Press book? And they want the faculty to publish lots of short journal articles that nobody reads. Mm-hmm. It's because it's a bean counting thing with deans and administrators in terms of getting reaccreditation at their universities. And I just didn't want to spend my whole career doing that. Right. Basically, working so that some dean can get a bigger job as a provost somewhere, or a university president and the heck with scholarship. And I wasn't about to do that, although I've always kept my hand in it to some degree.
Okay. So if it's good to switch over to your recent book here, The Problem with Lincoln. Are you able to hear me, Tom, or are we having connectivity issues?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the video might be choppy, but you got your copy there too. Great. So
I got my copy here.
Before we jump in, I'm sure people are curious, at what point, like, what made you center on, because you've written a bunch of stuff on Lincoln at this point. So how did you decide to pick that as a topic?
Well, I had a hobby as a Civil War history was sort of interesting to me. So I'd read a lot of books, and since I was living around Baltimore at the time, I even took courses at the Smithsonian in D.C. and went to lectures by all the big shot Civil War historians, James McPherson and people from Princeton and people like that would lecture at the Smithsonian. It was very interesting to me, and I got to thinking, well. Maybe there's room for me. I knew there was a literature on sort of in economic history on Civil War, but it was sort of overwhelmingly on slavery, the economics of slavery. And the more I started reading about Abe Lincoln, I realized that he was a Whig for about 25 years before the Republican Party was even created. And the Whigs and Lincoln were all about economic policy. They were all about mercantilism, basically, protectionist tariffs, government subsidies to build roads, canals, and railroads, and a national bank, bringing back the national bank. That's what they were all about. And so I read the history books, and I read there's a big economic thrust behind Abraham Lincoln's life, and I found they said almost nothing. And when I did find a couple of the books that were supposedly the book to read about Lincoln and economic policy, There's one by Gabor Boric, who's a big name in Civil War history. I think if he's still around, he's still at Gettysburg College. I think it was called Lincoln and the Tariff. And it says things like, Abraham Lincoln was a good-hearted man, and he advocated protectionism because he wanted other people to prosper in the way he had prospered, which is a big bunch of nonsense and BS. To anybody who took Econ 101 in college would know that's a bunch of BS. And that was sort of the extent of the economic analysis of Lincoln's ideas that I found. So I said, well, there's room for me here. That's certainly, I need to straighten these historians out here on that topic. And then the more I ran into it, I found that he was a, thoroughgoing mercantilist, corporate welfare, and a national bank. And then being a libertarian and being familiar with libertarian literature, the more I read, and I find that, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus and mass arrested tens of thousands of political dissenters, waged war without the consent of Congress and did these things and confiscating firearms. So there's a libertarian story to be told also. And when I did read about these things, the historians know about all these things. They know he did all these things, the suspension of habeas corpus and the imprisonment even of a member of Congress who was Clement Vallandigham from Ohio, who was his biggest critic in the United States Congress, a Democrat from Akron, Ohio, imprisoned him. He had soldiers arrest him, drag him out of his home in the middle of the night. The historians, I wanted to know, well, what are they saying about this? And I discovered that to be a Lincoln scholar, you have to look at things like this. And if you can think up a half a dozen or so rationales or excuses for why he had to do it, then you're a Lincoln scholar. And I wasn't buying it. I thought it was all spin and a distortion of the truth. So those two things, I thought the historian mention economics, but they don't know in economics. And then on the libertarian civil liberties issues, they make excuses for the demolition of civil liberties and the destruction of the Constitution. And so of course, my writing, which is why they hate me so much, and that I just lay it all out there, and I don't make the excuses. In fact, I say, well, this is an abomination that he did this, and they don't like that. And I also happen to have read the book by Fogel and Engerman on slavery, on the economics of slavery, where they lay out how all the other countries of the world ended slavery peacefully through some sort of compensated emancipation.
Right.
And there's a great book that's been written since then by Jim Powell. It's called Greatest Emancipations, which is an excellent survey of how all the other countries of the world ended slavery peacefully. That's why he calls them the greatest. And that really accord with me because the war, the historians now today say the war ended up with as many as about 750,000 dead Americans. And that's when the country had a population of 30 million. And so if you standardize for today's population, that would be about 7.5 million Americans dying in 4 years. And it struck me that was quite a high cost to pay if that was the cause of ending slavery, when all the rest of the world, including Massachusetts and New York, ended slavery without a war. There was some violence involved in places around the world, but no war of any kind, certainly not any that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And so that's how I got into all this. And also, by the way, kind of interestingly, right before I got started in writing on Lincoln, Joey Rothbard, of all people, Murray Rothbard's wife, Joey, dear old Joey, she wrote a big, long paper on Lincoln and the war, and said many of the same kind of things that I say in my book about it. And I had a copy of her manuscript at the time, and I think she presented it at one of the early Mises Institute conferences, and which is why I had a copy of her manuscript. And of course, Murray Rothbard himself gave a talk at the conference that the Mises Institute had on secession, and which is now a book. It turned it into a book. And he was interested in that. And I was intrigued by what Murray Rothbard had to say about the whole subject also. And I thought it deserved more research and more writing and more elaboration than what Murray and Joey had heroically done. Joey was a Virginian, so maybe she had sort of a familial incentive to write up that article.
Now, I forget, you're a Yankee, right?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, about halfway between Pittsburgh and Erie. So a friend of mine in South Carolina asked me where I was from, and I told him. He said, "Well, that's way up there. That's the deep north." Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to focus on, the cause of the war. I jotted down a few things when I was looking through your book here, but this is such an important one. So let me just read a quick passage. Most of this stuff, Tom, I think we can just do off the top of your head, but this one, this quote I hadn't seen before. So Lincoln on the causes of the war. So this is coming from page 26. And let's see, so this is you talking. You say, Lincoln started the address. So this was his first inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. Lincoln started the address out with what is arguably the strongest defense of Southern slavery ever made by a U.S. president or any American politician. Quote, "There has never been any reasonable cause," end quote, "for apprehension by the people of the South over slavery," he announced. Proof of that fact, Lincoln said, and now quoting Lincoln, "is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you." Later, he says, he quoted from one of his old speeches in which he said, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." And then later, "Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I made this and many similar declarations, and I have never recanted them." And then you also mentioned, I won't quote from it, I'll let you just talk about it, Tom, that he's saying the Republican Party, quote, "placed in the platform for my acceptance the clear and emphatic resolution which I now read." And he's reading from the Republican Party's platform for that, the 1860 election.
Yes.
So do you remember, do you need me to look it up, or do you remember off the top of your head some of the things that were in that?
In the resolution?
It's on page 27.
I don't want to misquote. I don't want to misquote myself.
Right.
I have the book in front of me here, though. But,
so it would be on page 27 if you just want to look at that, so you know where I'm drawn from. So you don't need to necessarily quote, but it's just mentioning how they're not going to interfere with the institutions of the South. And clearly, what do they mean by that? They mean slavery.
Well, yeah, they call them the domestic institutions of the states, by which they meant slavery. Well, it says, resolved that this is the platform, that the maintenance inviolate of the rights of the states, and especially the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions according to its own judgment exclusively, is essential to that balance of power on which the perfection, endurance of our political fabric depend. And so the Republican Party platform said that the protecting slavery is essential to the balance of power on which the perfection and endurance of our political fabric depends. So they actually said, our government can only endure if we protect slavery. So they were imploring the South to not leave the Union in doing that.
Right.
And Lincoln quoted it, verbatim right in the body of his first inaugural address. And even more than that, and near the end of the speech, he endorses the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, which had already passed the House and Senate, which was controlled and dominated by the Republicans at the time, that would have prohibited the federal government from ever interfering in Southern slavery. And I print the whole text of the Corwin Amendment and Lincoln's first inaugural address in appendices in my book, The Problem with Lincoln. And I also discovered that Lincoln lied about this in his first inaugural. He says, "I haven't seen it, but I understand a constitution has been brought forth, or a constitutional amendment has been brought forth that would do this. And then he says that he says that he has no problem with making it, in his words, express and irrevocable. That is, making the prevention of doing anything about slavery express and irrevocable in the Constitution." But what I discovered when I read Doris Kearns Goodwin's large 1,000-page book on Lincoln, it's called Team of Rivals, she dug up primary sources to show that this amendment came from Lincoln himself. Even though in his first inaugural he says, "Well, I haven't seen this amendment." But she found out that it was his idea, he got William Seward, who was to become his Secretary of State, and who was a senator from New York, to get the amendment passed through the Senate, which he did. And so, and that is in conflict with Lincoln's own statement that, well, I haven't seen it. But if you think about that, here's Abe Lincoln making his first inaugural address. A constitutional amendment has passed the House and the Senate that would have prevented the government from ever interfering with slavery being a very big point of discussion at the time. And he hasn't seen it. He hasn't seen it. There's no curiosity at all about it. He didn't ask somebody, hey, I just read in the Washington Post that the House and Senate passed a constitutional amendment. Maybe I should know about it. No, he claimed that he hadn't seen it. And that's just not believable.
Right.
And Doris Kearns Goodwin, of course, pretty much proves that not only had he seen it, but it came from him. And so Honest Abe told a big whopper in his first inaugural address. And then, of course, I argue in the same speech, if you just read it, he uses the words invasion and bloodshed to describe what will happen to any state that refuses to collect tariffs at the tariff tax, which had just been more than doubled 2 days earlier and signed into law by President Buchanan, the moral tariff. And so he literally threatened invasion and bloodshed and war on any state over tax collection. But he bent over backwards to defend slavery. And I say in the book that the only type of coercion he was concerned with was he promised to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in that same speech, which was a law passed in 1850 that basically compelled Northerners to run down runaway slaves and return them to their owners. And Lincoln enforced that in Washington, D.C. during his presidency. There were slaves that were captured, runaway slaves that were captured in D.C., and they continued to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and return them to the so-called owners.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I lied. Let me read one more thing here. And this is old hat, Tom, obviously for Civil War buffs and whatnot, but just on the off chance some listeners have never heard this one before. And they were taught, no, Lincoln went to war to free the slaves. What are you talking about? He's our greatest president because he ended slavery. So this is from page 29 of your book. So in August of 1862, and I'm just going to read this just because this is the smoking gun. Lincoln, writing his famous letter to the New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley, quote, so this is quoting Lincoln. And again, this is from summer of 1862, folks. So keep that in mind. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it would help to save the Union. Okay, so My question then, Tom, is it seems to me that's like unambiguous. Like, how could anyone possibly deny that? So I'm curious, what do the pro-Lincoln historians say when they want to make it out that, no, Lincoln really, we should credit him with ending slavery and this was a moral cause and that's why all those hundreds of thousands of people are dead, but Lincoln, had to do it to free the slaves.
Yeah, they mostly ignore it. It's even more powerful than that. I also, in an appendix to my book, The Problem with Lincoln, I have the Crittenden-Johnson Resolution, which is also known as the War Aims Resolution, where the Congress announced the purpose of the war. So you have Abe Lincoln, what you just read, saying the purpose of the war is to keep the Union together and has nothing to do with slavery. I'll read you one line from the official U.S. Congress War Aims Resolution, which is where here's the Congress announcing to the world what the purpose of the war is. They said, this war is not, a quote, this war is not waged upon our part in any spirit of oppression, nor for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, nor purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institutions of those states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union, end quote. So they announced that we don't intend to interfere with the rights and established institutions, by which they meant slavery. And so not only Lincoln, but the Congress said the same thing. It's not about slavery. And it's been my experience that the historians just ignore this. they've written book after book about his second inaugural address, but they ignore the first inaugural address, which I call Lincoln's Slavery Forever speech.
Mm-hmm.
And they just tend to ignore it. And then when, for example, when I make the point that if you read this speech, he threatens war over tax collection, but bends over backwards and does backflips to assure the world that it has nothing to do with slavery. I was actually in a debate in a magazine, a Civil War magazine, years ago when after my first book came out, where we did a debate online, back and forth, and then they published it in the Civil War magazine. And then I made this case that Lincoln himself said the war is about tax collection, but they just ridicule it. The response was just call it, oh, that's an old saw, that's an old myth, and things like that. And I knew I won this debate though, because it was with a professor of history from East Carolina University, and I get the magazine in the mail, the hard copy. And there's my side of the debate and the professor from East Carolina State. And then they added James McPherson on his side without me knowing it and without asking me to respond to what James McPherson said. So that told me I must have won the debate, because they had to bring in the big gun, James McPherson from Princeton, to make it 2 against 1. And he did the same thing, because I had done a pretty elaborate discussion in my part of the debate of the effects of the tariff and why it was disproportionately harmful to farmers in particular, in the South being an agricultural society. It made them feel they're being plundered by the protectionist tariff for the benefit of northern manufacturers. And so I guess they figured that if they would just argue by authority by bringing McPherson in here.
Right.
And I even cited a textbook, an international trade textbook, to make the point that here's sort of the economic thinking of the economics profession on tariffs, because these historians just couldn't get it. They just seemed like I couldn't understand the economics of tariffs. And I was making the point that here's what the mainstream of my profession says about this. And McPherson just mocked the fact that I quoted a textbook and not a treatise or something on tariffs, And so that's how they've treated it. They sort of mock it or ignore it.
Another element of this, again, this is, simple stuff for people who are advanced in this, but the Emancipation Proclamation, which I think probably most Americans believe, oh yeah, all the slaves were freed under that. And no, actually, what's the way the cynic will put it is Lincoln freed the slaves that he had no authority to do, and he didn't free the slaves that he did under the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right,
So
exactly.
can you want to explain what does the cynic mean when he says it like that?
Yeah. Well, I also include in an appendix in my book, The Problem with Lincoln, the full body of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so anybody can read it for themselves. And it says it applies only to the states in rebellion, it says. And so, of course, the U.S. government had no ability to emancipate anybody in the states in rebellion any more than they had the ability to influence England or Spain or France. It was, they had seceded from the Union, and their armies were in control of those areas. But at the same time, the Union Army at the time was in control of certain areas. West Virginia was the last slave state to enter the Union during the Lincoln administration. The Lincoln administration orchestrated the secession of West Virginia, carving it out of Virginia, illegally and unconstitutionally, I would add. Because the Constitution says it requires a vote of the state, and Virginians did not vote to give West Virginia to Abe Lincoln, but he did anyway. But that was exempt. It's in paragraph 4 of the Emancipation Proclamation. The whole state of West Virginia, which had slaves, was exempted from it, as were all the parishes in Louisiana where the Union Army was in control at the time, are mentioned by name and in the body of the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's when some historians say that he freed the slaves where he had no ability to, quote, freed the slaves where he had no ability to free the slaves, and that's what they're referring to. So it didn't free anybody. When you think about it, if the Emancipation Proclamation did free the slaves, why would they go through all the trouble of passing the 13th Amendment? to the Constitution that ended slavery, if slavery was already ended. And Lincoln was mocked and ridiculed by people at home and abroad for this, and for good reason. They thought it was hypocritical. The purpose was probably, in my opinion, to instigate slave rebellions, which never happened. That didn't work to do that either. And he also calls it right in the body of the document a war resolution, meaning if the South rejoined the Union the next day, it would have become void and of no consequence. And so that's what Lincoln's words were himself about it.
Just in the interest of fairness, so I looked up and I was trying to find, Tom, like what would the pro-Lincoln historians say about that? So I believe the argument they make is to say Lincoln was such a scrupulous follower of the Constitution that he said, I don't have the authority to interfere with what states are doing in terms of slavery, but the ones in rebellion, that's sort of like anarchy, and so military rule applies. So that's why, we can, under the cover of, wartime emergency, I'm allowed to do whatever I want, basically, in areas in rebellion. And so that's why I have the authority to issue an order freeing those slaves. But the other ones, there it's the rule of law, and I, as the mere president, don't have the authority to, because of states' rights. So they're basically saying Lincoln so respected states' rights, that's why he couldn't free slaves in Union-controlled territory.
Yeah. Well, that's a bunch of baloney, because several of his generals were sort of out of his control for a while. They were out in the field, and in Georgia and in a few other places, just issued their own orders. The Union Army came in, they won a battle, took over the towns, an area there, and they issued their own emancipation order. And Lincoln not only rescinded it, but fired the generals for doing that in the war. So and that would be a complete contradiction of what you just said, what the historians say about he was such a stickler for the Constitution, and he wanted to use the military to free the slaves in the southern states. Well, he had opportunities to do that, but the military commanders who did do that earlier in the war, he kicked them out of the commands, and Fremont was one of them, and General Fremont, and sent them somewhere else. And so that contradicts what's being said there. And of course, the same historians praise Lincoln for being a destroyer of the Constitution. There's a book by a Columbia University historian named Fletcher, a law professor named, not a historian, a law professor named Fletcher. It's called Our Secret Constitution. And he praises Lincoln to the treetops for ignoring the Constitution, illegally suspending habeas corpus and things like that. And so I don't buy that argument for that reason too.
So I guess related, if we could move on to this issue of war crimes and whatnot. So when it's not merely on the issue of secession, but even given that the North is going to wage a war to bring the Southern states to heel, they didn't follow standard rules of conduct, and they did all sorts of things. So just in your book. I meant that metaphorically, it is literally your book too. But just some of the things for the benefit of the listener who's just never heard this before. Like they were just taught Lincoln was a great president, and I'm sure he was very tenderhearted. And so it's not merely that, I don't like the fact that he didn't let the states secede, but just the conduct of the war. And also, if you could talk too, could we just say, well, Lincoln didn't know what his generals were like? He didn't know what Sherman was doing. Lincoln was out of the loop. He had no idea what was going on.
Yeah, they sort of portray him as Joe Biden, don't they, when it comes to war crimes? But one of the things that probably made the Lincoln scholars, as they call themselves, really angry with me is that I quoted, the dean of Civil War historians for many years was James McPherson, the Princeton history professor. And one of his books, I quoted him extensively as bragging about what a micromanager Abe Lincoln was of the war effort. He said he spent more time in the War Department telegraph office than he did in the White House during the war. And he was, arguably the most hands-on micromanager of any war Americans have ever been involved in, and on and on and on like that. But then at the same time, he's supposed to be totally in the dark of what his armies are doing. at the same time, and it's just nonsense to believe that. And so when Sherman gets to General Sherman gets to Atlanta, the Confederate Army is gone. 80 to 90% of the population of the city is gone. There's only women and children and old men left, and then he spends 4 days having his artillery bomb the city. And I cite a book about Sherman saying that in one day, 5,000 artillery shells fell on Atlanta during this bombardment, this 4-day bombardment, only of civilians and buildings. And Sherman's military engineer, a man named Captain Poe, told him that it was of no military significance. And Captain Poe was looking through his spyglasses and seeing the corpses of women and children in the streets. And he was imploring Sherman to cut it out and stop it. And Sherman just coldly told him, no, it'll quicken the end of the war. And Lincoln rewarded Sherman and made him a big national hero. During his time before he died, and so the idea that he did not know about this is just not believable, because you can't be the biggest micromanager of any American war, as the same historians tell us, and at the same time be totally in the dark, because this was not the first incident of this. This had been going on for years. At the very beginning, they plundered Manassas, Virginia. They waged war on civilians. They killed civilians all throughout the war with the bombing of cities and towns, and the plundering and looting and arson that went on. I have one section of the book. It's entitled "An Army of Pyromaniacs," detailing how they went in some places, like in South Carolina, setting fire to house after house after house. Not military facilities, but private homes, and Lincoln knew about all this, and all the generals who did this were rewarded, promoted, and made heroes. So I'm not buying it, because I don't think it makes sense at all. And I think when you read about this, it shouldn't make sense to anybody else either.
And besides just, the soldiers can get out of hand, and who can defend that, war is hell, that sort of thing. But also, and you alluded to this, but again, just in the sake of completeness, I mean, Lincoln would do stuff like you said. He arrested a congressman. He would jail newspaper editors and so forth who were against the war, like even in the North, right?
Yeah, well, in the North, if you did a little, you don't have to read my books. You can go to a good university library and look up some of the books. There's one called "Lincoln and the Constitution" by a famous Civil War historian of the last generation. And they recount all these. There's a book called "Freedom Under Lincoln" by Dean Sprague, another university press book. He shut down over 300 opposition newspapers. Some of the editors and owners were imprisoned for opposing the war. The mayor of Baltimore was imprisoned. Congressman Henry May of Maryland was imprisoned. And this was all without due process. These are people who were arrested by soldiers and dragged off to some gulag somewhere. There was a fort called Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor that was sort of a gulag set up for these sorts of people. Even the grandson of Francis Scott Key, who was a Baltimore newspaper editor at the time, he wrote an editorial complaining about the illegal suspension of habeas corpus, and he ended up in prison at Fort McHenry, of all places, and which was also a prison that was set up for the political dissenters. And so that's another thing that I mean when I say that it's. I laugh when I hear the historians say that Lincoln was such a stickler for the Constitution with the Emancipation Proclamation, like he wouldn't dare do anything that's unconstitutional. Well, the invasion of the southern states itself was an act of treason. In my book, The Problem with Lincoln, I quote Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, which defines treason. It says, treason against the United States is only, use the word only, defined as levying war upon them, use the word them, or giving aid and comfort to their enemies. And so them and their are in the plural. That means the phrase United States refers to the individual states that were united in creating a confederacy of states. Okay, it's in the plural. So levying war against the individual states is a definition of treason in the Constitution. That's exactly what Lincoln did. He levied war against the southern states. Okay? So he and everybody who participated in the war were guilty of treason under the Constitution. But during the war, Lincoln took it upon himself to redefine treason as criticism of himself and his administration's policies. That's how they, quote, justified the mass arrest of all these people, the newspaper editors, ordinary people on the street who overheard saying things that they thought were detrimental. Lincoln even made one speech that I quote, where he said, "The man who remains silent while his government is being discussed is guilty of treason." And that's very creepy. Our friend Yuri Maltsev once told me that that's what they did in the Soviet Union, that they could accuse you of treason just because you didn't praise Gorbachev or whoever the dictator of the day happens to be. They would use that if they wanted to put you in prison for some other reason. They would use that as a reason on the old under communism. But it's the same thing that Lincoln said.
Speaking of that, I seem to remember, I don't know if this is at your fingertips, didn't the Soviet government, when they were cracking down on, I don't know if it was Hungary or if it was much later, when they were, the socialist republics were trying to break away and they cracked down, and didn't they say, no, we're just doing what Lincoln did, like to get the U.S. to shut up, in terms of the court of public opinion internationally?
Yeah, they do that. Tyrants all over the world. That is true. Tyrants all over the world have done that. One of my more incendiary articles on LouRockwell.com was after I debated Harry Jaffa in California after my other book came out. I knew he was going to pull this, but he was fond of saying things like when he criticized Judge Robert Bork, for example. Bork wrote a book on the Constitution. Jaffa would say things like, well, Bork sounds a lot like John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis. That was Jaffa's way of saying, well, maybe Bork is a closet neo-Confederate, and so we should ignore him. And so he always sort of pulls that sort of thing. And then and he did that with me when I debated him. And then he would often sort of say something like he equated the Confederates with Hitler. Jaffa did. Right. And so he would say, I think he said something to the effect when I debated him that, Hitler would probably agree with DiLorenzo. That's a debate line, a real zinger. So I went home and I recalled that in college, way back when, I took a course in European history, and we actually read some parts of the Mein Kampf from Adolf Hitler. And I remember there was a chapter in there on federalism, states' rights. So I went and bought a copy of Mein Kampf, put it in a brown paper bag, and walked out of the store with it. Because I wanted to reread that chapter, which I did in the bookstore also. But sure enough, there's Adolf Hitler quoting Lincoln's first inaugural address, where Lincoln denies state sovereignty, and Hitler was using Lincoln's own words to make the case for abolishing state sovereignty in Germany at the time and creating a highly centralized dictatorship in Germany, like Lincoln had done in America. And then another thing I cite in my book, The Problem with Lincoln, is when the Pakistani dictator Musharraf, about maybe, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, I forget when it was, declared martial law in his country, he justified it by quoting Abe Lincoln, because Abe Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and had military rule in the North in his country. And so there's a long history of tyrants around the world using Abe Lincoln as their example.
Another negative offshoot of all this, or consequence, you talk about in this book, and again, folks, Tom and I are here talking about the problem with Lincoln. The link, of course, would be at bobmurphyshow.com/137, and I'll link to all this other stuff Tom and I have been talking about. Okay. You mentioned the what happened to the Plains Indians. And so, do you want us to speak to that?
Well, yeah. Murray Rothbard, he wrote an essay called "Just War." Your listeners might be, if they're interested in this whole topic, they might Google that and find Murray Rothbard's article online called "Just War," where he discusses a lot of these things. And one of the things he mentions is that a friend of Lincoln's named Grenville Dodge was made a general. And Grenville Dodge became the chief engineer of the transcontinental railroads after the war. But Murray Rothbard said during the war, Grenville Dodge's job as a general was to kill off as many Indians as he could who were in the way of where they wanted to build the transcontinental railroad. So he sort of commenced the Indian Wars during the Civil War by getting the Indians out of the way for where they wanted to build railroads. And so in part of my book, The Problem with Lincoln, I talk about, part of the legacy of the waging of war in the South was all the same generals, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Custer. They all, literally 2 months after the end of the Civil War, Sherman was put in charge of what was called the Military District of the Missouri. And the whole country was divided into military districts, as though the states no longer existed for a while anyway. And this was all the land west of the Mississippi. And his job was basically to wage a war of genocide against the Plains Indians to make way for the government-subsidized transcontinental railroads. I quote Sherman as saying, "We're not going to let a few thieving Indians," he called them, "stand in the way of the progress of the railroads." And so I discussed there how all of these generals who were called Civil War luminaries turned right around and waged a war of genocide, basically against another colored race, the Native Americans and the Indians. And they ended up killing, according to one historian of the subject that I quote in the book, about 45,000, and that included many women and children. And then the rest were put on reservations. And I quote Sherman as saying, "where they can be watched." And of course, he became, among his famous slogans at the time were, "the only good Indian is a dead Indian." And he also, I quote him also as saying that what he was doing was what he called, quote, "the final solution to the Indian problem," end quote, which is kind of a creepy phrase because Hitler used final solution. I'm not saying Hitler got this language from William Tecumseh Sherman, but it's just kind of creepy to read those words coming out of General Sherman so many years before that. And so that's very telling because General Sherman himself, I quote him as saying that one reason he was doing this is just as he opposed interracial marriage between whites and blacks, as Lincoln did. He didn't want to see interracial marriage between Indians and whites either. And Sherman himself, I quote him as saying, that happened in Mexico, and they've created a race of mongrels. He called a big part of the population of Mexico mongrels because there had been intermarriage with Native Americans or Indians. And that's telling because most Americans think that these people were racial heroes, racial saints, waging the Civil War against evil Southerners, but they weren't. Right. This is who they were.
Yeah, and what I was thinking about that when I was reading your book on the treatment of the Plains Indians and how you're saying the same generals that came in and slaughtered a bunch of Southern civilians then turned their guns literally on the Native Americans to make way for the railroad. I'm sure there's a lot of...
And they recruited black ex-slaves to be the so-called Buffalo Soldiers to kill the Indians. And it's, they celebrate the Buffalo Soldiers because they were among the first to be, black people to be in the U.S. Army and all that. But what they were doing in the U.S. Army was reprehensible.
Yeah. But so what struck me, though, is I'm sure there's plenty of modern day, let's call them social justice warriors, for lack of a better term, who would praise, oh yes, Lincoln's army is going in and freeing the slaves and sticking it to the white patriarchs in the South, but yet they'd also be horrified at the oppression and genocide of the Native Americans by the evil white man. And it's kind of ironic that no, it's the same group of people, so maybe you shouldn't be so quick to endorse, rampant warfare and slaughter just because you happen to agree with the cause in one instance, that's going to be used in a way you disapprove of.
Yeah, and it might cause you to question the the motivation for the slaughter of the Southerners too. You know, if they weren't the racial saints that you thought they were, well, maybe they weren't 1 year earlier either. You know, if they weren't racial saints in 1866, well, maybe in 1865 they weren't so saintly either in what they're doing in the South. And you know, Bob, I have a whole chapter called Lincoln's Greatest Failure. And it's much of it is a kind of review of this book by Jim Powell called Greatest Emancipations, that talks about how all the rest of the world ended slavery peacefully, and they found a way to do it. England, and even Ron Paul, who has read my other books on the subject, was on one of the network televisions back when he was running for president, and somebody asked him a question. I forget which. I think it was. One of the big commentators on MSNBC, I think it was, asked him about the Civil War question, and he said, "You don't even think we should have had waged the Civil War to free the slaves, do you?" And Ron made my point that, we could have done what England did and used tax dollars to buy the slaves and then end it all legally, if the alternative was getting involved in a war that killed 750,000 people. And all the economic destruction and the diversion of capital that took generations to recover from North and South in the war. And I'm sure that anybody who heard that was kind of shocked. But that's an important point, I think, that I make and needs to be made, because most Americans would think if there was slavery in the British Empire and the Spanish Empire, there must have been some big war that somebody ended slavery with a big war. But no, only in America was there a war associated with the ending of slavery. And so I make the case in my book that we could have done what everybody else in the world did if we had a real statesman as a president, rather than a guy who threatened invasion and bloodshed of his own people, tax collection.
And yeah, I think it's even worse than that, Tom. I think most Americans, to the extent they think of it at all, vaguely kind of think that slavery was this uniquely American thing, and that slavery didn't exist. And then in the founding of the colonies, some Americans in the South invented slavery, and then Lincoln ended it, thank goodness. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the way you hear people discuss it, you could understandably walk away thinking that slavery was this unique thing that happened in the American South on plantations, and as opposed to being a worldwide institution that went back to antiquity. So, and you're right.
3,000 years. 3,000 years. When the Muslims enslaved the Christians, in antiquity, they were all white slaves. And so all civilizations had, for 3,000 years, had slavery of some kind. And if you get into this literature, you'll find out that of all the slaves that were brought to the Western Hemisphere from Africa, about 5% of them ended up in America, in the United States. The other 95% somewhere in South America, the West Indies, somewhere else in the Western Hemisphere. But we ended up about 5%. So yeah, you're right. Americans don't know this. And we're taught just a few slogans about Abe Lincoln in elementary school, and then they're repeated for the rest of our lives, and we're supposed to believe them all. But and that's been my experience of what the average American knows. I guess
I'm going to respect your time here. So I guess the last question I have for you, Tom, is stepping back, what's your explanation? Why is it that it seems like the school system is geared towards, elevating Lincoln when people say, who are the greatest presidents? I mean, they necessarily have to be wartime presidents a bunch of people died on their watch. Like that's a given to say who's the greatest. Right. But why is it Lincoln? You would think maybe going to war against the Nazis or whatever, but it's always Lincoln is the hands down favorite. So what's your explanation in terms of, what's the motivation for the people doing that? Why is that the outcome?
Yeah. Well, I write about it in the next to last chapter of The Problem with Lincoln. I quote a book that was published in 1943 by a man named Ira Cardiff. It's called The Deification of Lincoln. And I couple that with a discussion of another book called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln by Larry Tagg. And Larry Tagg makes the case based on primary documents that Lincoln was the most hated and reviled of all American presidents in history during his lifetime. And why wouldn't he be? He suspended habeas corpus. He mass arrested thousands of northern civilians. He invoked conscription and drafted and ordered the shooting of deserters in his army after they conscripted them into his army. So, why wouldn't they hate him? And they did. But because he became a martyr after he was assassinated, the Republican Party and the clergy, the New England clergy especially, turned him into a secular saint. And so Ira Cardiff, this author who wrote the book in 1943, said that Americans don't even prefer to know the real Lincoln. They prefer what he calls the supernatural Lincoln. And they sort of associate themselves with the saintliness of this image that was created after his death. And it's almost funny to read about this, because Lincoln himself was never a Christian. His own wife called him an infidel. His law partners called him an infidel. They said he was never a believer in God. But some of the very first books that were written about him after his death made it sound like he spent most of his time in the White House on his knees praying to God. And there were images of him ascending from a tomb with angel's wings, for example, some of the 19th century artwork in Harper's Magazine. And that took hold. There's this sanctification of Lincoln. And so by the time you get to 1943, Ira Cardiff said, you probably can't find the publisher who would publish a book that talks about the real Lincoln, because there's been so much hysteria. He used the word hysteria over Lincoln. He said Americans prefer hysteria. And another point about this, well, maybe a final point I'll make is, I also quote the book, The Legacy of the Civil War by Robert Penn Warren, famous author of All the King's Men and many other novels. He was asked to write this book in 1960 on the centennial of the Civil War. And he said that this myth of Lincoln, the supernatural Lincoln, created what's called a treasury of virtue of the U.S. government. So much so that whatever the U.S. government did, Spanish-American War, involvement in World War I, was moral and virtuous by virtue of the fact that it was the U.S. government doing it. That's Robert Penn Warren's idea. And so it's not a surprise to me that the public schools have evolved in a way that sanctifies Lincoln, because they equate Lincoln. He's the ideological cornerstone of the American state, the image of the American state. And that's one of the reasons why I've written these books. I'm a libertarian, and I think it's a good idea to chip away at the ideological cornerstone of the unconstitutional American state. And if by no other means just informing people about reality, and not the supernatural or the hysterical Lincoln that the historians have portrayed him as being for 150 years now.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Folks, my guest has been Tom DiLorenzo. You can get links to his new book, The Problem with Lincoln, and all the other stuff we discussed. It's going to be at bobmurphyshow.com/137. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bob, and good luck with that new baby.
Oh, yes, we got a good night's sleep last night, so it's all right.
Oh, eureka. Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom.
Hey, take care.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.